Her hands were trembling as the soldiers lifted her into the carriage. She was 16 years old. Court records remember her as Consort Han, one of the Korean tribute women sent into the Ming palace, and she had just been handed over to the Emperor of China. Her mother wept as she signed the document. She couldn't write, so she used an ink mark. One less daughter to feed, one less mouth in times of famine. Han travelled for weeks in a sealed carriage alongside 15 other Korean maidens. They couldn't look outside. They couldn't speak to each other. One girl who tried to escape was brought back with her hand crushed. She died of infection days later. Her body was left at the side of the road. The others learned the lesson. Resistance was not an option. When the gates of the Forbidden City closed behind her, Han discovered that serving the Son of Heaven had nothing to do with honour. She would live 16 years inside those walls. She would watch an entire harem disappear in a single night. She would beg to see her mother one last time, and she would die in white silk. Subscribe if you're new, and leave a like if you want us to keep unearthing these stories, because what comes next is worse. Han's story began the way tens of thousands of others did, with a system designed to harvest young women like crops. When people think of Chinese imperial concubines, they imagine something elegant. Beautiful women in embroidered silks writing poetry, a life of luxury serving the most powerful man in Asia. That image is propaganda. The imperial concubine system existed for over 2,000 years. During that time, tens of thousands of women disappeared behind the red walls of the Forbidden City. And what most people don't understand is this: concubines were not wives. They weren't considered human under imperial law. They were classified as precious objects, literally equated to porcelain vases. Every 3 years, imperial officials travelled through the provinces in what they called the Shunu selection. Sounds elegant. Don't be fooled, it wasn't an audition, it was a forced harvest. During the Ming Dynasty, no family was exempt. All unmarried young women of eligible age had to be presented. Hiding a daughter was a crime punishable by death for the entire family. Candidates were inspected by eunuchs and palace physicians. They checked every inch of their bodies for imperfections, birthmarks, scars. Any defect disqualified them. Those who passed were taken. Families received minimal compensation, but refusing the money meant admitting treason against the emperor. The system didn't need to kidnap. Poverty did the job. And what happened to the families left behind? Most never heard from their daughters again. Letters were forbidden. Visits were impossible. Occasionally, if a concubine rose to high rank, her family might receive a small stipend. But for the vast majority, their daughters simply vanished into the red walls. Some families held funerals for daughters who were still alive, because they understood the truth. The girl they raised was already gone. Han arrived in China as part of a different tribute. Korea sent women to the Ming Empire as part of diplomatic agreements. Between 1408 and 1435, more than 100 Korean women were sent to the Forbidden City. Not as visitors, as property. The day Han crossed the palace gates, she ceased to exist as a person. She became a number, a possession of the Son of Heaven. But before she could serve, she had to be broken. The selected women didn't go directly to the harem. First, they went through what the eunuchs called refinement, a process that could last between 6 months and 2 years. The first phase was identity destruction. They cut their hair, a sign of dishonour in Chinese culture. Their names were replaced with numbers or generic titles. They were forbidden to speak of their families. Mentioning their mother resulted in physical punishment. Any personal possession from home was confiscated and burned. The women slept in barracks, 20 to a room. They were woken before dawn. They went to sleep after midnight. For months, they existed in a state of exhaustion so complete that Harita resistance became physically impossible. The second phase was submission training. The women learned dozens of different ways to bow. They practiced 8 hours a day. If a bow was poorly executed, They were beaten with bamboo rods on their legs. Many carried those scars until death. They learned to walk without making noise, to keep their gaze lowered, to respond without being asked, to exist without taking up space, to smile when they wanted to scream. One training manual from the Qing Dynasty lists 47 different rules for how to stand in the emperor's presence, 47 ways to exist in a single moment. Violation of any rule meant punishment. The third phase was preparation to serve the emperor. I won't go into graphic details, but historical documents describe a systematic process designed to eliminate any physical or psychological resistance. The women were examined monthly. Those considered inadequate were subjected to treatments that palace records describe with clinical coldness. Palace medical records describe the process with chilling detachment. Notes from 1723 refer to candidates presenting resistance and preparation protocols that required multiple sessions. The clinical language barely disguises what was being done to these women behind palace walls. Administrative records, official documents, written as if they were talking about training horses. After months of this, the women who survived were considered ready to enter a world where their suffering had only just begun. After training, the girls entered the official system, and here began another form of hell. The hierarchy was brutal. At the top, the empress, the emperor's only official wife. Below her, the imperial consorts. Then high-ranking concubines divided into multiple levels. And at the bottom, common concubines, sometimes hundreds of them. And preparation women, girls whose fate had not yet been decided. Your rank determined everything. The amount of food you received, the colour of your clothes, the size of your room, the number of servants, even the type of dishes you ate from. The empress received more than 22 pounds of prime meat every day. A low-ranking concubine received barely 4 pounds, and often not even that, because provisions were stolen by corrupt eunuchs before reaching the kitchens. Many low-ranking concubines suffered from malnutrition. Their teeth fell out, their hair thinned, they aged decades in years, and the cruelest irony, their declining appearance made them even less likely to be summoned. It was a downward spiral designed into the system. The emperor didn't visit his concubines. They were summoned. Every night, a eunuch presented the emperor with wooden tablets bearing the names and portraits of available women. The emperor pointed to one, and then the ritual began. The chosen concubine was taken to the bathing palace. Female eunuchs bathed and prepared her. But they didn't dress her again. They wrapped her in a silk blanket like a package, only her face visible. Why? Because a clothed woman could hide a weapon. 2 eunuchs carried her to the imperial chambers. They unrolled the blanket at the foot of the bed, and the concubine, without any clothing, had to crawl toward the emperor without raising her eyes. And here's what almost no one knows. A chief eunuch remained in the room throughout the entire encounter, behind a screen, but present. His job was to keep time. After exactly 30 minutes, he announced loudly, "Time to preserve the golden essence of the Son of Heaven." The emperor had to finish immediately. If he didn't finish in time, the eunuch would enter and physically remove the concubine. After each encounter, the woman was examined by an imperial physician who recorded every detail. Why? Because if she became pregnant, there needed to be absolute proof that the child was the emperor's. But here's what made the system truly perverse. Most concubines were never summoned, not once, not ever. There were hundreds of women in the harem, sometimes over 1,000. The emperor might summon 1 or 2 per week. Do the math. A concubine could spend her entire life, decades, waiting for a call that would never come. Aging in silence, watching younger girls arrive, knowing that her only purpose, the only reason she was taken from her family, would never be fulfilled. And yet she couldn't leave, couldn't marry, couldn't have children with anyone else. She was property in permanent storage. With nothing to do but wait, the women turned on each other. The imperial harem wasn't just a prison, it was an arena. Hundreds of women, all competing for the attention of one man. all knowing that a single pregnancy could change everything, or destroy everything. The result was a hidden war that lasted centuries. Concubines poisoned each other's food. They bribed eunuchs to remove rivals from the selection tablets. They spread rumours designed to make other women fall from favour. Historical records document cases of women slipping abortifacients into pregnant rivals' tea. If the baby died, so did the mother's chances. Centuries before the Qing, the same logic already ruled the palace. Empress Wu Zetian, one of the few women to ever rule China in her own name, allegedly strangled her own newborn daughter and blamed a rival concubine. That concubine was executed. Wu rose to become empress. This is disputed by historians, but the fact that it was believable tells you everything about the harem's culture. The violence wasn't always physical. Psychological warfare was constant. Senior concubines tormented juniors. Favourites were isolated and undermined. Alliances formed and shattered based on who the emperor looked at during dinner. One account from the Qing Dynasty describes a concubine who spent 3 years pretending to be friends with a rival, only to testify against her when the empress launched an investigation into disloyalty. The rival was demoted to servant status. Her children were taken away. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake, it was survival. In a system where women had no power except through the emperor's favour, destroying your competition was the only strategy that worked. The tragedy is that the system turned victims into perpetrators. Women who had been kidnapped, trained, and dehumanized learned to do the same to others, because the alternative was being destroyed first. And if a concubine somehow survived the warfare and caught the emperor's attention, if she became pregnant, that's when the real nightmare began. Here's the truth no one expected. Getting pregnant was the worst thing that could happen to a low-ranking concubine. Common logic would say that a child of the emperor would elevate her status, but reality was crueler. A pregnant concubine was isolated in the most remote palaces of the Forbidden City. She spent 9 months under constant surveillance. She couldn't receive visitors, she couldn't send letters, she couldn't walk through the gardens. And when the baby was born, it was immediately separated from its mother. If it was a boy, he was handed over to wet nurses and raised far from his biological mother. She could see him perhaps once or twice a year, supervised by eunuchs without permission to touch him. If it was a girl, many times she simply disappeared. Imperial records didn't bother to document the fate of low-ranking concubines' daughters. There are documents describing women so desperate to avoid this cycle that they secretly consumed abortive herbs. They preferred risking death rather than bringing a daughter into that system. And if a son died, the mother was often blamed, accused of negligence, sometimes accused of murder. Even when children died of common illnesses, the mother could be demoted, exiled to remote palaces, or worse. One concubine during the Qing Dynasty lost 3 children to smallpox. She was accused of having poisoned karma and spent her remaining 40 years confined to a single room, forbidden from seeing any other member of the imperial family. Her crime was burying her children. Her punishment was dying alone. But as cruel as daily life in the harem was, nothing prepared the women for what happened in 1421. In 1421, Emperor Yongle had just inaugurated the Forbidden City. It was the peak of his power. And then, a rumour destroyed thousands of lives. One of the emperor's favourite concubines was found dead. Officially, she was declared poisoned. But rumours said something else. They said she had taken her own life after an affair with a palace eunuch. And that the reason was the emperor's impotence. Yongle went mad. Humiliated, paranoid, he ordered an investigation. But he wasn't seeking justice. He was seeking to silence everyone who might know the rumour. In a single night, 2,800 women of the harem were executed. Not just concubines. Also servants, cooks, laundresses, any woman who might have heard something. The method was death by 1,000 cuts, a form of execution designed to prolong suffering. The executioners were told to make it last. Some victims took hours to die. The screaming could be heard throughout the palace complex. Girls as young as 12 were included in the massacre. Women who had served the palace for decades, pregnant concubines. It didn't matter. Anyone who might have known. Anyone who might have talked. By dawn, the courtyards had to be washed with buckets of water carried from the palace wells. The same wells where, in later years, so many women would choose to end their own or lives. There is no official record of this event in imperial documents. The Ming court erased it from history, but the testimony of Lady Kui survived, a concubine who was outside the palace that night, visiting a sick relative. She escaped the purge by accident. Years later, Lady Kui dictated her account to a Korean envoy. She described the scream that lasted until dawn. The courtyards slick with blood. Eunuchs dragging bodies through corridors she had walked every day. She named women she had known, girls she had trained alongside, friends who had shared her meals. Her testimony was preserved in Korean diplomatic archives, where Ming censors couldn't reach it. It remains one of the only first-hand accounts of what happened that night. Lady Kui herself didn't escape for long. When Emperor Yongle died 3 years later, she was among the women selected for accompanying sacrifice. Her last recorded words, preserved by the same Korean envoy, "I survived the night of blood only to die in silk." Han, the young Korean woman from our story, also survived the massacre. She was among the few who weren't executed, but her relief was short-lived. 3 years later, when Emperor Yongle died, Han was included in the list of women selected for eternal honor. During the Ming Dynasty, there was a practice called shunzang, which means accompanying sacrifice. When an emperor died, his favorite concubines were buried with him, alive. The logic was simple and horrifying. The emperor would need company in the afterlife. And what better company than the women who had served his desires in life? 3 days after the emperor's death, eunuchs compiled a list of the selected. Between 5 and 30 women, depending on the emperor. The chosen ones received a last sumptuous meal. Delicacies they had never tasted. Wine they were usually forbidden to drink. Some accounts describe musicians playing while the women ate, as if it were a celebration. Then 2 options. The first hanged themselves voluntarily with white silk cords. This was considered an honourable death. The woman's family received economic compensation and official recognition. Some families encouraged their daughters to accept willingly, knowing the alternative was worse. The second, refuse. In that case, eunuchs would hang them by force or drug them with opium until they lost consciousness. Their bodies, some still breathing, were placed in a seated position in chambers around the main tomb, arranged as if they were waiting, attending, serving even in death. In 1958, archaeologists opened the tomb of Emperor Jingtai. They found remains of 16 women in side chambers, all seated. Analysis showed cervical trauma from hanging, but 3 skeletons showed signs of struggle. Fractured bones, scratch marks on the stone walls. They were buried alive, and they tried to get out. This practice was abolished in 1464, not out of compassion, but because the families of the victims were starting to cause political problems. Han wasn't that lucky. She died in 1424, 30 years before the abolition. When she begged to be allowed to return to Korea to care for her elderly mother, the new emperor rejected her petition. They hanged her with white silk and buried her alongside the man who had destroyed her life. Han's death came before the practice was abolished, but for the women who came after, abolition didn't mean freedom. It meant something almost worse. The abolition of accompanying sacrifice didn't bring freedom. It brought something different. Decades of confinement. Concubines who survived their emperors were sent to the palace of perpetual solitude in the most remote corners of the Forbidden City. The rules were simple and brutal. Never leave the complex, never marry, never have contact with the outside world. Perform manual labour, pray for the dead emperor 3 times a day. For decades, they lived in collective dormitories, sleeping on mats on the floor. Basic food.